Welcome to Nature News Live. If you're joining me on YouTube or on Instagram, I am here to talk about yesterday's Nature News episode on YouTube where we discussed the future of salmon fisheries in Alaska. So I got a lot of questions from you on Facebook, Twitter, and on Instagram that I wanted to answer. So if you have questions also that you have on fisheries, on salmon, please put them in the chat. I will be answering questions as we go as well. So if there's anything that you want to know, and I will try to answer questions here on Instagram too if you're following there. So first off, if you haven't watched yesterday's video on the future of salmon fisheries in Alaska, basically covered the shrinking decline in size of salmon, which is a huge economy for not only the Alaskan people, the United States, a lot of different populations around the world. So it's a really important part of the ecosystem as well. So one of the questions that I got that I wanted to answer was how much salmon has declined as a whole. And this is kind of a hard question to answer because there's a bunch of different species of salmon and they live all across the world. But I will say that migratory fish as a whole have actually declined by 76% since 1970. Now, this isn't a new report that was recently released. And many of these migratory fish, which Chinook salmon is one, are threatened by overfishing, habitat degradation, and dams. So as far as salmon goes, just over 465,000 Chinook salmon were reported to be in the Salish Sea in 2010. And this is actually a 60% reduction. So that's huge considering how much salmon we eat here in the United States and around the world. This is a really big part of, the global appetite. So if you love salmon and it's part of your diet, I'd love to have you tell me in the chat as well. Also wanted to give a shout out to people in the chat. Andrew DeCessory, hello. The percentage of decline, it really varies as far as the salmon populations go because there are a bunch of different species of salmon. So in Alaska, it has declined, as I said, by 40% for the species of Chinook salmon, which are going to be the ones that are fished in the Yukon and a lot of the Alaskan rivers. Atlantic salmon have declined by about that same amount. There's also Pacific salmon, which are declining, but I don't know that I did do some research. I could not find a lot of global studies that really showed in total what the actual percentage of decline in each one of these different species is. So that's something that I'm still looking into, but I will do a follow-up to this on Instagram and let you guys know when I get a little bit more details on that percentage of decline of the salmon. One of the other questions that I got, well, I'll follow that up with saying that there's actually been a 29% reduction in the number of harvested salmon. So this is how much salmon we're actually getting in the global fisheries. Funnily enough though, salmon were actually protected in a lot of fisheries in the United States, in Alaska, those areas. They are controlling the amount of fish that people can catch. And so this has actually helped the fishery a lot. Back in 1917, they actually allowed 7.3 million fish to be caught, and there were only 8 million in the ecosystem in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. So the United States has really done a lot to protect this fishery, but globally that hasn't happened because salmon are migratory. They obviously swim in the rivers, they go out into the oceans, and then they come back. So it's a lot of countries that would have to work together to protect this fish species, and that in itself is a huge problem for the fish species and fish populations in the world in general, because so many countries would have to work together to protect these marine ecosystems. And while that is beginning to happen in some places, as a whole, it's not really happening. If you guys know, whaling industry, things like this, these are all big issues that would be maybe not fixed, but we would have a better time managing global fisheries, the sustainability of these different food sources and ecosystems if we all kind of work together. I also want to give a shout out to Krieger versus Big Brother. Thank you so much for joining us in the live chat. Andrew just asked too, which I'll take a little side note here. He asked what inspired me to do nature news, and that's a good question because this has been like a passion project of mine for a really long time. So I love nature and the environment, and I actually have a degree in environmental management. So I studied sustainability, I studied how to mitigate water damage. Fisheries was actually one of the things that I studied as well. Climate change, air pollution, all these things. So I've always wanted to give back and be able to share some of the knowledge that I have and some of my love for nature. So that's why I started Nature News. And I'm really glad if you're joining here for you to come and chat with me about nature news. So if you are new here, make sure you hit subscribe, make sure you give this video a thumbs up, make sure you share it with a friend so we can grow this community, so we can get more people engaged and educated on some of the most important environmental and wildlife and natural sciences issues that we're currently facing that don't always get a lot of time in the news. So I wanted to, with that being said, let's move into one of the next questions that you guys had from, this is a question on Facebook, or a comment I should say, also on YouTube about dams and salmon. So this might be something you've heard in the news for the last, maybe 20 or even 30 years. So this is a problem not just in the United States, but kind of all around the world. Dams that have been built for hydroelectric power, sometimes other reasons, have been huge issues for the salmon populations. And this is because the dams prevent salmon from going back to their spawning grounds. And if you don't know a lot about salmon, basically the salmon, they're born in a river, they go out into the ocean, and then when they're supposed to be like around 7 years old, they swim back up the river and they go back to their spawning grounds to have, fish babies. And the dams actually prevent this natural process from happening. So the fish either get stuck, they die earlier than they should, or they have their eggs in areas where they are going to die and not reach maturity. So it can be a big issue. And as a whole, dams are a big problem globally, but in the Pacific Northwest specifically, it has been a very controversial and a long ongoing issue because a lot of dams were built in the early 1900s and throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and people immediately saw that it was an issue to the fisheries. So since then, people have been advocating for dam removal, which has actually just started to happen in some places in Oregon and Washington. While it's not happening a lot yet, there are a lot of dams that have come down. A dam came down just actually a few weeks ago, which was in Nature News back in July. And it's pretty controversial, as I said, because not everyone believes that the dams are harming the salmon. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife actually has on their website that dams are harming salmon. But they've actually been working a lot over the years to try and figure out, okay, how can we have dams and how can we have salmon at the same time, and how can they work together? So U.S. Fish and Wildlife has actually gone as far as to take the junior salmon in trucks and actually drive them from one area of the river upstream and then basically drop them back off upstream, hoping that, or downstream I guess for the juveniles, and then upstream for the adults, hoping that they can kind of fix the ecosystem with a little bit of trucking and shipping. So kind of interesting and a little bit out there, but I mean, they're having to do the same thing in Norway with reindeer because of low snow melts, which is a whole other issue and maybe another video at another time. But that's one of the things they've been doing. They've also built salmon ladders, which you might have heard about, and I'm not talking about the ones that are in Ninja Warrior. So salmon ladders for actual salmon are basically, think of the salmon ladder in Ninja Warrior, but that goes all the way up a dam, and it allows the salmon to basically flop their way up the dam and then get into the water that's on the other side. It doesn't always work, but they're trying to come up with different ways to fix this issue, and that is one of them. So kind of interesting ingenuity on how they're doing that. Andrew also just asked in the chat that if they're replacing these power sources in those states, as far as the dams go. Yeah, that's a great question, because most of these old dams are actually not even really being used anymore for electricity. They're either outdated or they have other ways to get the energy to the power grid. And so most of the dams that have been taken down haven't even added any electricity to the power grid in some time. And the bigger ones that are a bit more controversial are still being used for hydroelectric power. So I think that's why those ones are having a bit more of a difficult time actually potentially going to be taken down. So that's probably like a 10 or 15 years in the future thing if that does happen. But in other countries, this is an issue as well. You know, we've got a lot of places in China, also in Africa, that they're building some of the world's biggest hydroelectric dams right now. And they're going to displace a lot of wildlife, probably screw up a lot of fisheries, among other species. So dams, while they do provide a lot of electricity, like anything, I guess, can be really harmful to the environment. And also in these places like in Asia and Africa, you know, they're going to displace a lot of people too. So that's kind of the update on that. One of the other questions that we had from the chat was on, let me just go down here, guys, sorry, was on orcas. So I wanted to give a little bit more clarity on orcas, aka killer whales. Hi everyone over on the Instagram as well. And if you guys aren't following me on Instagram, you guys can check that out at Alice's Adventures on Earth. If you're not following on Instagram, on YouTube, it's Alice Sport Adventures on YouTube. Molly just asked on Instagram, is this the new townhouse? Yes, it is, Molly. It's nice to see you. So thanks for joining. And I'm going to actually leave Molly's information below this video in YouTube, because she actually works in marine biology, and she is an awesome person that we should chat with more about some of these issues. So I did want to talk about orcas. I actually talked to Molly recently about maybe swimming with orcas in Norway. That's kind of one of my bucket list trips. But the southern resident killer whales are a group of killer whales that are located in Washington State, basically. They live off the coast of Washington State, kind of in that area there, and they pretty much eat only salmon. So they've been really hard hit by this decline in salmon in this area. They actually had an unexplained 20% decline between 1995 and 2001 in their population. And you might remember a few years back that there was this horrible stuff on the news about a mother orca pushing its dead baby for days and days on end through Puget Sound. This was that subspecies of killer whales. So really sad. Now there's only about 73 individuals in this whole group, in this whole subspecies. And one of the reasons for that is Chinook salmon, which is their primary prey, has declined so much. A lot of that has to do with dams and because of climate change. So a lot of different issues there that have really shown up in the other species that live off of this fish as well. One of the other issues they think with these whales is actually exposure to high levels of toxins, which is coming from agricultural runoff, leaching from the land into the ocean, also big tanker ships that come through this area, because it is a really big highway for ships. So those are some of the issues with that species of killer whales that does eat the Chinook salmon and is in danger from that species declining. And we have a few more questions. So Reed Sawyer also on Facebook asked about mercury in fish, which is something that I think a lot of people wonder about. So if you've ever wondered about this, also please let me know in the chat or leave a comment down below. So mercury in fish is still a big issue. While you probably won't get mercury poisoning unless you eat, fish several times a day and you're eating really big fish, did want to talk a bit more about it. So the fish that you have to worry about the most that have the highest levels of mercury are king mackerel, marlin, orange roughy, which used to be my favorite fish, but I stopped eating it a long time ago, shark, swordfish, tilefish, ahi tuna, and big eye tuna. Now, all of these fish have pretty high levels of mercury. So women, if you are pregnant, if you are nursing, or if you plan to become pregnant, I would absolutely avoid these fish. I personally do not eat swordfish ever anymore, even though it was like my favorite fish growing up, just because it does have high levels of mercury. And as Molly just said in the Instagram chat, yeah, big predators have higher levels because there is something called bioaccumulation, which basically means, you know, if a small fish eats a little bit of something with a bit of mercury, and then a big fish eats that, and then a bigger fish, you know, just think about, okay, you're combining now all of that mercury, little bits, little bits, little bits. But the big fish, because it's eating a lot of little fish, has a lot more mercury. So anything that's huge, you know, the bigger it is, the more mercury it's going to have. So those are things to think about when you are choosing which fish to eat in your diet. And I'm a pescatarian, as some of you may know, some of you may not know. So fish is a really important part of my diet. I no longer eat meat, so that's really like one of my main sources of protein. And I think a lot of you that I've talked with are kind of in the same boat. So I would say don't eat fish more than 3 days a week if you can. But those are some fish that you should think about more of avoiding, or just eating very rarely if you are going to eat swordfish or big eye tuna, some of those other large fish. Just do it very sparingly, and don't eat other fish in that same week or that same month if you can avoid it. And some of this mercury also, just so you guys know where it's coming from and why it's in the oceans, a lot of it actually comes from burning coal. So this is probably another video also, but when we burn coal, that coal goes up into the atmosphere, right, in these dirty emissions. It rains down when we have rain, weather patterns, etc., and it ends up in the soil. It ends up also in the oceans. So, and in the oceans, when it gets connected with plankton or little, you know, things here and there, and then as Molly said in the chat, you know, then we have this bioaccumulation in the ecosystem where that mercury, you know, rained up in the sky, came down into the ocean, and now it's in the fish we eat. So it's a big issue, and this is why obviously coal is starting to be phased out. It's not the only reason, but that is one of the side effects of that. I just wanted to add also, Molly in the chat brought up a good point in Instagram. She said people should avoid tuna because, well, A, they're going to be extinct within 50 years, and they are one of the worst managed fisheries, you know, globally, and there's so much demand from sushi, canned tuna, things like this, that, you know, we're really not managing that fishery well. So salmon is one thing, but yeah, there's all these other fisheries that we're managing very, very poorly. So it's interesting because one of the first classes I think I took in college was actually fisheries management. We talked a lot about this, and I'm sure Molly, you too have studied this a lot as well, being a marine biologist. But, you know, with anything, with vegetables, with cows, with fish, the things that you have to pay attention to sustainably manage a population of anything when you're eating it is to make sure that you're not eating more than can be naturally replenished within the course of that year. So yeah, Molly just said she took fisheries management too in grad school, so that's pretty funny. But yeah, they do this with trees too, you know, with logging. But like, if say you have 10 trees or you have 10 fish, well, you can't cut down 8 or you can't eat 8 because you're not going to be able to sustainably replenish that population within that time span. So that's what sustainable, like harvesting, sustainable management of any species that we are using on this planet has to be. It has to be that we cannot use more than can be sustainably replenished. And we don't manage this well on a global scale. there are countless species from fish to wildlife, lions, elephants, these kinds of, lots of other animals where we are killing a lot more than we can naturally replenish. So that's another big issue. Dorian Darter also in the chat just said, that he had his cousin had a stocked fish pond while he was growing up. That's pretty cool. I had a pond of goldfish and koi fish actually growing up, so I learned to love fish very early. And I just had 2 more questions from social media. We covered overfishing. I also want to talk about farmed fish versus wild fish, because I think this is something people get really confused about when they go to the grocery store. We're seeing farmed fish in a lot more places, especially, it's all over the grocery store. It's hard to know if you're supposed to buy farmed fish or if you're supposed to buy wild fish. And you might see when you travel that you might go to places where you see big rings like all like that in the ocean. And these are actually where they farm fish. So it's kind of controversial because the farmed fish, they do use, chemicals sometimes, they use different foods, and it can affect the wild population of fish as well. So I would recommend trying to eat wild fish if you can. Like if you can't avoid and you have to eat farmed fish, that's okay, but I would definitely try and buy wild fish. There's also a company called Marine Certified Species, it's MSC. You might see that labeling on fish, and this is actually a sustainable fisheries certification company. So if you see that label on a frozen fish or a fresh but frozen at the grocery store, these are good fish to buy because they have been certified okay by this regulatory board. So it's good to look for those when you are at the store as well. I just got another question from Instagram. Philip Jordy, hi, how are you? Just asked, isn't the way we fish a huge problem? Yeah, huge nets catch a lot of fish species and they're killed and thrown back to the sea. Yeah, so this is another big problem, is how we catch fish. And the way we catch fish all over the globe is totally different. Long lining has been banned in a lot of places, but in some places it's okay. So, and then we have these big nets that are used in a lot of places that have a lot of bycatch. And when I say bycatch, I mean, they may be trying to catch tuna and they end up catching dolphin, or they end up catching sea turtle. So every fishery has to be managed differently, but I think the big problem that we have globally is that we don't have enough people or governments managing their fisheries, and then we have a ton of international water that's just not being managed at all. And recently, I don't know if you guys saw this on my Instagram story or if you've seen it on Instagram in general, but over in the Galapagos, within the last few weeks, we had over 100 Chinese fishing boats over there trying to illegally catch whale shark, other sharks, turtles, dolphins, all these things from this very protected marine ecosystem, and they basically were sitting right on the border of the marine sanctuary. And every time animals, wildlife would come in and out of that area, they were catching them. And, this is because, that China is the largest eater of fish globally, and they've pretty much fished out all of their oceans, and so now they're coming around the world to feed their mouths, and taking away, critical species and depleting the global fish populations because nobody is stopping them. And if they're obviously in international waters, it makes it really difficult. But yeah, going back to netting and things like this, I mean, it's all different depending on where you go, but we do need to get rid of a lot of the long lining and that kind of catching, because it's basically think of a string with hooks, and then throwing that in the ocean. I mean, you're gonna catch all kinds of stuff. You're gonna catch turtles, you're gonna catch shark. And a lot of the times these fishermen, the non-good ones, will basically just kill the animal, or they'll leave it to die, which is really terrible. And then don't even get me started on, sharks, because that's a whole other kit and caboodle of stuff. And some shark species have declined by more than 75% globally. So it's a huge problem. And Molly just said in the Instagram chat, one of the problems with fishing management is that the fish move. Yeah, that is so true. And so countries really need to work together to set limits. They need to endorse catch limits and monitor takes. Now, this is something that I had talked about briefly when I talked about the salmon fisheries in Alaska and the Yukon, because the United States does have those catch limits. They do have those take limits, and the native populations like the First Nations up in the Yukon also have limits on how much fish their people are allowed to get. So yes, this is something we absolutely need to work together on a global scale. And it's just something that we don't do in this world. We rarely work together, right? We can't even work together in our own country, let alone, working together for the entire globe. But I mean, if this world is gonna survive and all of our children and our children's children are gonna have a nice, a park or trees to breathe clean air and not have to wear a mask because of, dirty air pollution, and have food that's not grown in a jar or something, we all have to do better, and we have to really encourage our governments to work together too. I just wanted to address 2 more questions in the chat here. Andrew just said, with the current government and our catch limits something that are getting changed? Actually, no. So I haven't, that's a good question. And, the Trump administration has obviously rolled back a lot of environmental laws. I have not seen any changes to fisheries management, but that is really more of a state issue as well. So I don't think that we have to worry too much about that. But I did say in yesterday's video, one of the things with Alaska and the Yukon is that Alaska and the Yukon have a treaty that allows the native population in the Yukon to be able to get salmon, because if you watch that video, I put up a map and you see that basically the salmon have to get from the ocean all the way across the state of Alaska, which, as we know, is huge, before they get to the Yukon. And the First Nations people for like 11,000 years have lived off salmon. So the last 2 years, there haven't been enough fish to fulfill this treaty to get over into the Yukon. So those people are really suffering a lot from the decline in this species, and maybe we're allowing too much fish to be caught in Alaska, and that's why we don't have enough to get through to the First Nations people. I don't know, that's something I should definitely look more into and find some more information on. I also just wanted to say thank you again to Arjun Badari and Krieger versus Big Brother for joining me here, and thank you for coming and giving this a video a like and a subscribe. So thanks for being part of this community. And let me just see if there's any more questions here in the chat. Yeah, Molly brought up one more good point just about fish and in general. You can't see them, but fish need a long time to reproduce. And this was one of the big issues that I talked about in yesterday's video, was that, they're supposed to get to a certain age before they reproduce, and they need to be at a certain size. So like, think about even women, you can think about, imagine if women in this country, instead of having children at 25 or 35, all of a sudden we're having to have children at 10 or 8. That's basically what's happening to a lot of the fish population, because climate change and habitat degradation and all these things we've kind of talked about are making it so salmon or fish in general, like, they're not getting big enough. They are sometimes getting fished, they're getting caught before they're reaching maturity, but all of this stuff is affecting, the size they get to, and they're having to reproduce sometimes earlier than they should, and they're not getting, to the size that they need. So it's it's affecting a lot of things. So that's a really good point that you said as well. And yeah, Philip just brought up one more last thing here about microplastics. This is something I've mentioned in some of the nature newses before as well. Microplastics are a huge issue. Unfortunately, microplastics can now be found in every corner of the planet. They are in every ocean. They just did a recent study. I'll have to tell you where that study was in the comments after this, but this study basically it caught a bunch of fish from all around the globe. Every single fish that this research team caught had microplastics in it. Every single one. They've now found that microplastics are even in the soil in agricultural fields, so it's really everywhere. And you know, if you don't know how we get microplastics, it's because too many people are littering, we're not recycling, plastics are left to rot all over the planet, and basically after a little bit of time in the sun and the weather, they break down into teeny tiny particles. And that's, you know, plastic is made from petroleum, so it's poisonous to us, and it's poisonous to the planet and to the wildlife. That's a whole other issue, which maybe we'll talk about in another video too, just the dangers of microplastic and kind of some swaps we can do in our daily lives to avoid plastic. Also got some videos, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, on my YouTube channel you can check out. If you do want to make some swaps in your house to try and use less plastic. And before we end this video today, that makes me want to tell you guys to make sure you're recycling and make sure you are, you know, reducing as much as you can and not littering and protecting the planet as much as you can as well. So, you know, just do your part and don't be afraid to tell other people to share your knowledge or come and point them to me. I would love to engage with people about how to protect our environment, how to do better in our own lives. So please have people, you know, comment below, tweet me, Instagram me, you can DM me, use the hashtag Nature News if you have other questions about nature. And make sure if you are new here, you subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and share this video with a friend. If you're on Instagram, thank you so much for joining me. You can also share this video with a friend or my channel. And if you didn't watch yesterday's Nature News, you can check that out on my YouTube channel as well. If you want to continue the conversation, as I said, connect with me on social media. Next week, I'm actually going to be doing a deep dive on wolves, because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife actually, in the United States, just announced they are going to try and delist wolves from the endangered species list in this country before the end of the year. And obviously, that's one of probably the best success stories of endangered species in the United States outside of bald eagles. So it's a topic that's really dear to my heart because I love wolves, and if you're into wolves, I would love for you to join me next week to talk more about that. So thank you guys all for joining me so much, and I will see you all next week right here on YouTube and Instagram. And thanks again. Don't forget to subscribe.